When people ask what the thrill of World of Warcraft has been for me for all these years, I usually hit them with the same reply. Awesome PvP, questing, being part of a social experience, and of course my personal favorite aspect of the game, collecting all these pets. Oh yeah, baby. Okay, it's the raiding. The idea of taking a large crew of friends or even just some randoms into dangerous enemy-filled locations to fight for righteousness. It's awesome. Or you could just fight for a bunch of loot, you know? Lots and lots of loot. Purples. While many MMOs have had their own versions of raiding, I've always felt that WoW has done it the best. It evolved and changed over the years in such a great way, fluctuating both in difficulty and design. And for the most part, raiding has been an impressive experience. I like a lot of different raids, so naturally putting them into a top 10 list is going to be a challenge. But it's a challenge I wish to take. So let's dive in and see what I would consider to be the top 10 best raids in World of Warcraft. And of course, we're starting it off with number 10. At the beginning of our list is Sunwell Plateau from Burning Crusade. Linear design is often looked at as an unnecessary design choice as it forces players to tunnel vision without taking in the details that surround them. Naturally, this isn't always the case, however. Sunwell is a very much linear raid, but it does almost everything else so right that I honestly tend to forget I'm just walking forward the whole time. The bosses are impressively designed, the difficulty is some of the highest in the history of WoW, and the Blood Elf architecture is beautiful to take in. The story for Sunwell is also very tragic and empowering all at the same time, and has one of the most badass WoW villains ever as its final boss. I mean, Kill Jaden, popping out of the Sunwell alone is just intense. But his fight, it's a whole nother level. It's crazy. It's one of the most awesome fights ever. Overall, Sunwell isn't the most versatile raid, but its high difficulty, impressive boss design, and decent story make for an overall fun time. Number 9 might get me witch hunted, but I have my reasons. At number 9 is Firelands. Let me just start out by saying that Firelands is a stellar raid. It's huge, it has options, epic bosses, and one of the most badass final boss fights in the history of the game. I really appreciate that Blizzard kept this similar to Molten Core, but greatly improved the formula in almost every way. I never feel quite as bored with the color scheme and theme like I did back in Molten Core. The new Ragnaros fight, especially on Heroic, is just amazing. Like, bar none, I crapped my pants the first time I saw him climb out of the lava. I also love the other bosses like Listrazor and Rylith for being just slightly out of the norm when it comes to a typical boss. They were more aimed at a fun audience and helped to break the repetition as it built up. As I mentioned earlier, this raid's very open-ended, and I actually appreciate when a raid doesn't tell me to handle this boss in this order. It leaves everything for me to choose what to do next. Honestly, the two things that hold this raid back for me from being higher on the list would be its very low difficulty curve, and the fact that it's surprisingly short, which honestly makes sense seeing as it was supposed to have a supporting raid with Abyssal Maw that was sadly never added. But nonetheless, Firelands is an extremely memorable and fun raid. Coming in at number 8 is Siege of Orgrimmar. Mists of Pandaria was well known for its heavy focus on PvP, but surprisingly Blizzard made a primarily PvP focused expansion have some of the best raids in WoW history, and Siege of Orgrimmar is no exception. Siege of Org is a perfect answer for what a lot of raiders seek in new content. Length. The raid is massive, and while for the most part it is linear, it helps to, like many of the nicer linear raids, apply environmental differences to break the repetition. Starting in corrupted Pandaria, you travel to Orgrimmar itself, where you delve deep into the hostile city, from the depths of Ragefire Chasm to Garrosh's stronghold itself. The boss fights are also great in variety and size, not just orcs here. Giant robot scorpion? Check. Proto Drake? Check. T-Rex? Checkaroo. At 15 total bosses, Siege has a lot to do and a huge amount of difficulty curve to help keep raiders busy for hours and hours. I'm looking at you, Paragons. You monsters. At number 7 is Blackrock Foundry. Understand when I say that my opinion towards Warlords of Draenor is pretty low, that I came in late to the expansion and I just wasn't impressed with the content it offered. I was, however, greatly impressed with its raiding options. Though limited, WoD had 3 amazingly crafted raids. The opening raid Highmaul was wonderfully themed and had a little of something for everyone. And the finale raid Hellfire Citadel gave us some closure, though a tad bit poorly written. And hell, we got to face off against Archimonde, so that's something. But if I had to give my award for best Warlords of Draenor raid, it would have to be Blackrock Foundry. Sometimes it amazes me how Blizzard can just take a concept like, oh, I don't know, orcs? You know, the thing that we just saw a whole crapload of in Siege of Orgrimmar, and then later this whole expansion, and still keep it fresh and innovative. Blackrock Foundry breaks all kinds of molds when it comes down to its complexities. Fun and extreme bosses meld together to keep the momentum building. Bosses like Operator Thogar who just offer a lot of fun in one encounter, as well as bosses like Black End himself who, in my opinion, help to break the mold on what the final boss can possibly do in a raid. Blackrock Foundry may not offer a unique environmental design beyond what you see for the first 5 minutes, but it's the fun design choices and boss encounters that help build what I would say is one of the best raiding experiences available in Draenor. Freezing its way in at number 6 is Icecrown Citadel. Wrath of the Lich King took us on arguably the best ride in WoW history. It had tons of content from epic raids, fun questing, intense PvP. Yep, it was awesome. Naturally, to tie it all together, it needed to end with one badass raid. Ruby Sanctum, oh yeah! Okay, so the story really ended with Icecrown Citadel and the downfall of Arthas, the Lich King. A story that by this point was over 6 years in the making. It was good to finally get some closure, but more so that we got to traverse the depths of the frozen hell itself known as ICC. Filled with Arthas' most badass minions, epic battles against bosses like Syndra Goza, Professor Putricide, and Starfang are just a few of the impressive bosses we got to see. But it wasn't just about the epic bosses. There were a lot of fun bosses like Dreamwalker and Loot Ship to keep us busy as well. The dungeon design is great, very much fitting into the theme of the expansion, even going so far as to match the different types of wings with each of the different types of Death Knights, basically? Like Frost, Blood, and Plague? That's basically unholy. And then there's the final showdown with Arthas himself, which to this date is argued as possibly one of the hardest raid encounters of all time. If that epic fight doesn't get you, then the touching cinematic that follows after you beat him will. Oh, and the fact that Arthas kills you at the end of the encounter is just... Blizzard, you did a number on me with this one. Kudos. Number 5 goes to Throne of Thunder. I hear it all the time about how TOT is the Ulduar of Mista Pandaria, and I don't necessarily agree with that. Personally, I find its linear progressive design to be more similar to Black Temple. This isn't a bad thing, however. Throne of Thunder progresses in such a way that keeps us on our toes, and gives us a large amount of variety in details and environments. The environments in TOT are some of my absolute favorites. I specifically love the underground section because it offers this really chilling, almost horror-esque feel as you delve deep into the atrocities the Thunder King has committed. The boss fights in TOT, much like the trash and environments, are varied and offer a lot of challenge and uniqueness. Getting to fight bosses like Megara the Hydra and the twisted amalgamation Dark Animus are just a few of the cool, more unique designed bosses. The lore is rich here as well, and it all wraps up beautifully with the final insane showdown with Li Shen, the Thunder King himself. This encounter is nuts. It's just so wonderfully designed, and it's a very progressively built encounter that I just have to love. Of course, if that's not enough for you, you could always do it on Heroic and gain the additional boss fight with Rod-N, an Algalon style boss. So I guess it's kinda like Ulduar? TOT wasn't the most versatile raid when it came down to options, but it didn't need them because how it was built, in itself and its lore, made up for everything. Coming in at number 4 is the previously mentioned Black Temple. Much like TOT or Siege of Orgrimmar, Black Temple thrives on a progressive evolution of dungeon details and enemies to make the player feel like they're actually moving forward. Black Temple starts in a sewerway, moves to a battlefield, delves into deep darkness of the inner sanctum of the temple, before driving you up a sex dungeon to the very top of the tower itself to face off against one of WoW's most iconic characters, Illidan Stormrage. The progression, as mentioned earlier, is some of, if not the best in raiding, keeping things from getting stale while also making sense from a design point of view. One thing I do love is that BT isn't completely linear, however. It does offer several branching pathways halfway through the dungeon, just in case you felt the linear design was getting a tad bit too boring. The bosses are epic. I mean, Supremus? It's freaking, he's awesome. And Terran freaking Gorefiend, man. Let's just say when I heard his opening speech for the first time, I had shivers going down my spine. All of BT is impressive, but the main man Illidan himself puts on the true masterpiece of the dungeon, and easily one of WoW's most cinematic boss fights to date. You battle him tooth and nail, Warglaive Fellfire, Eye Beams, and a cast of characters to assist you bring down together one of the most amazing boss fights, in easily one of the most amazing dungeons. We are at our number 3 spot, and taking number 3 is Naxxramas. I've talked quite a bit about linear versus variety in a raid. Both can be done properly, though most people tend to prefer variety. Naturally, when I think about intense options in a raid, one raid that beats them all is Naxxramas, offering me 4 stellar wings upon entrance to choose from, all filled with unique trash and bosses to throw myself at for fantastic loot. The boss fights are pretty unique in themselves, and they often are credited as being the first real mechanic-heavy boss fights ever, paving the way for future raid boss designs. Hygen the Unclean always comes to mind as a really fun, challenging boss. Doing his dance will forever be burned into my mind. But other bosses like Kel'Thuzad and Gothic the Harvester always brought their own brand of fun to the table as well. I've always loved that Naxxramas had a very scary, edgy feel to it, like more so than even Icecrown Citadel. Something about Naxx's color scheme, its intense themes, that just all merged together to make easily one of WoW's most frightening places. Whether it's the original 40-man with its intense challenges, or the 10 and 25-man versions we gained later, Naxx offered a huge amount of variety and choice, and it was all executed very well. My top 2 spots were easily the worst for me to choose from. Usually I have a general idea when I make these lists of what number 1 will be, but sadly this time I had 2 very amazing raids fighting for 1 spot, so choosing was rough. Coming in at number 2, just barely, is Karazhan. Kara is one of those raids that can stay a beacon for iconic raiding through years and years of content. It's just that well made. The design layout of the dungeon is purely masterful, having this very creepy castle appearance before completely blowing your mind with a design choice that could easily be described as Salvador Dali's wet dreams. The bosses are in great supply and varied, but more than just that, they have a lot of fun mechanics to toy around with. The Opera event is easily one of my, if not favorite, boss fights of all time. I mean, a rotating storytime themed boss? How could you go wrong with that? And don't even get me started on the chest event, Blizzard. This is genius. It not only gives you a break to de-stress before the final boss, but it's replayable with your raid. Talk about a smart boss design. Of course, if fun isn't all you're after, Kara has a decent ramping difficulty, while starting out really easy that pumps the gas near the later half, with dungeon bosses like Prince Malakazar, and the secret boss Nightbane easily putting your core to the test. Design-wise and mechanics-wise, Karazhan is masterful, and to some it's the greatest raid ever built. I love it for those reasons, and I always will. The number 1 spot is here, and I could think of only one other possible raid to contend for this spot. At number 1, and the greatest World of Warcraft raid, is Ulduar. You might have heard about 1 billion times or so about how awesome Ulduar is. It's like the greatest raid ever, right? It's amazing. Ulduar slept with my sister. You probably know all those same old sentences, but I'm here to tell you that as someone who's raided both versions during content, they're all true. Except the sister part. Anyways. Ulduar is a non-stop thrill ride on how to properly build a raid for everyone. The first half of the raid is slightly easier, like a slow burn for beginners, whereas the second half greatly increases in difficulty to encourage skilled play and teamwork. The lore is rich, having one of my favorite WoW villains of all time as the final boss. The design is just stellar, even offering several branching paths, and some design differences near the end. The optional stuff you can do, like hard modes, putting together Algalon's Key, which bosses to fight and win, making the legendary mace, it all wraps together to make the greatest WoW raid ever. Honestly, some of my favorite highlights from WoW come from this raid: riding the train to Memoron, fighting Algalon in his epic astral battle arena, taking on the old god Yogg-Saron, stacking Pyrite on Flame Leviathan, and so much more. We may all have different opinions on this subject, but you can't deny that a lot of people seem to find Ulduar amazing, and I 100% agree with them. Well, that's it. If you enjoyed the list, why not subscribe and check out some of our other videos? By the way, what's your favorite and least favorite raids in WoW? Tell me in the comments. I'm always down to debate and talk. As always, I'm Captain Potato, and I'll see you guys next time, next video.